So welcome everyone here in the room and online. We're delighted that you are here for the inaugural Dionne Price Public Lecture. This is an event that is very special to the ASA because Dionne was so very special to the ASA. So we're glad you're here, and I want to take a moment just to welcome the Price family here, right here in the front row. So glad you all are here. So this is the outline for what's going to happen today, and my main job is to introduce my friend Lissa Lavange. You're going to hear the word former a lot in this introduction because now that Lissa's retired, former goes in front of a lot of things. Former ASA president, former director of the Office of Biostatistics at CEDAR at the FDA, former chair of the Biostatistics Department in the School of Public Health at UNC, but current great friend and great friend of the ASA. So we invite Lissa up to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Ron, for the introduction. I need a current title. I am a grandmother. I hold on to that one. And I still consider myself a statistician. I try to have statistical thoughts a few times every week anyway. This is just such a privilege to be here today for a lot of reasons. Most importantly, the inaugural Dionne Price Public Lecture. It took ASA about a minute to get the lecture series organized because there are many fans and friends of Dionne out there that wanted to do something in her honor, and especially honoring all that she's done to statistics. Dionne, if you know her, was just an exceptional human being, a kind person, and led an impactful life. She touched so many people in so many different ways, and statistics is just one, but it's the one I know, so it's the one we'll talk about just for a minute before we get to our featured speaker today. I had the privilege to actually work with Dionne closely for 6 years when I was at FDA. She was a team leader, promoted to division director, and soon after I left, became the deputy of the office. She was a mentor. She was a brilliant statistician, statistical reviewer, knew so much about drug reviews and approvals. She was just, it's hard to describe. She had a smile that just didn't stop. New reviewers that she recruited, which she did excellently, trained under her, and she was able to multiply her talents with these other reviewers that she grew into more senior reviewers. We have the acting director of biostatistics here today, and he and I, Mark Levinson, we were just talking about Dionne. I have lots of stories about Dionne. I've had occasion to talk since her untimely death about some of the ways that she impacted me personally, but the biggest was just that big smile, and coming into her office when I was beleaguered by something that wasn't going my way and frustrated at working for the government after many years in the private sector and not being able to do more what I wanted to do. I'd go into Dionne's office and she just would flash that smile and help me sort of walk through some solution or another, and I just leaned on her. She was that kind of person, and I was her boss. I mean, a lot of people leaned on Dionne from below and beside and above, right? And it wasn't just us statisticians. She emanated her brilliance and her joy throughout all of CEDAR, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, and all of FDA. But I knew Dionne even before that because, yes, I'm a proud Tar Heel. I'm not going to talk about basketball this year. But she has a degree from UNC, from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She got her master's degree. And it's my alma mater, and I was adjunct faculty and then later faculty and department chair. So we shared Tar Heel stories as well. She did not get her PhD from us. She went to Atlanta and went to Emory University, so they get to claim her doctoral studies. But really the net result is she's got 2 top-ranked departments of biostatistics that claim her. just because she's so wonderful and has done so much. So the I guess what I want to say about Dionne, to wrap this up and get to the purpose of today, is that she just touched a lot of our lives and left a big hole, but she also left an impact and, you know, changed the world for the better with all that she did. Spent her whole career at FDA and was so dedicated to getting safe and effective drugs to patients that needed them. That's what she did. And she had a passion about it like she did about so many things. So we honor her today with this first public lecture. And we have an incredible speaker to kick it off. So this is Claire McKay Bowen. And Claire works right here in the Urban Institute. She is a senior fellow, and sorry, I'm supposed to be moving this along, and leads the data governance and privacy practice area here at the Institute. Her research focuses on technical and policy solutions to safely expand access to confidential data. It's all still confidential, right? We want our data confidential. For advancing evidence-based policymaking and ensuring everyone is responsibly represented in data, also important. She has an interest in communication. Communication has been a theme of many ASA presidents, and communicating statistics. You know, I glossed right over Dionne Price being president of ASA, and I probably should have said a couple more words about that and her many initiatives. But the ability to speak effectively, something Dionne advocated for in the FDA, because the FDA statisticians have to explain why this drug works or this drug doesn't work to a lot of people that are not statisticians. So that was a real force. And when Dionne was 2023 president of ASA, her initiatives included communication and included leadership, something that was a personal favorite of mine. She knew where statisticians needed to go to be ready for the future. And that future includes the data and how to talk about it, keep it safe, make sure it's representative. All of these things tie in with Claire. Anyway, in 2024, Claire became an ASA fellow, and I'll read her citation. I'm not sure if it's up there. She was an ASA fellow for her significant contributions in the field of statistical data privacy, leadership activities in support of the profession, and commitment to mentoring the next generation of statisticians and data scientists. Further, she is a member of the ICPSR Governing Council and several other data governance and data privacy committees. History-wise, Claire got her BS in mathematics and physics from Idaho State, MS and PhD from the University of Notre Dame. And she went to Los Alamos Laboratory working on cosmic ray effects on supercomputers. I think there's a Marvel movie coming out about that. When she's not doing research, she enjoys participating in endurance races, such as gravel races, you got to tell me what that is, and long-distance triathlons. Her goal is to participate in more of these, and she likes hiking, snowboarding, knitting, and playing with her pets. So you could work some stories into the talk.
Oh, yes.
All right. After the talk, we have a question and answer period, and you can use this QR code to send your questions. Ron Wasserstein will be the moderator. So when Claire is talking, think about what you might want to ask her and work with that code, and we're going to leave that up for just a minute.
We'll put it up again at the end, and we'll also have opportunity for live questions here as well. Okay.
So I'm just thrilled to introduce Claire to kick off the Dionne Price Lecture Series, and thank you all for coming, and those of you on Zoom, thanks for participating.
Oh, I don't have to stand in front of there because I think I have a mic. Can you guys, oh, you can hear me. Excellent. Maybe not excellent for all of you, but you are here, so you're here to listen to me. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I am honored and very excited, also super nervous to give this inaugural Dionne Price Public Lecture. Today I'll be talking about, oh, I think I need to move ahead. There you go. Today I'll be talking about the importance of government data, data that are truly of the people, by the people, for the people. These data are essential for providing the care and resources our communities need to thrive. At the same time, we need to carefully consider the overall data governance, the privacy, the security, and ethics throughout the life cycle of that data. And only then can we then consider and talk about our stories that will inform public policy decision-making driven by evidence, promoting the well-being of our communities and our nation. It's 5 a.m. and my Android alarm clock goes off. I hit the snooze button. 10 minutes later, it goes off again, and I read the local and national news on my phone, through the Firefox browser, and through certain emails. A little later, I turn on my Spotify playlist, listening to my morning jam as I go and I take a morning swim, which is recorded on various platforms here. Of course, on Venmo, I have to pay my swim coach, and I say for March for the dues. At some point, I turn on Outlook, Slack to do my work communications. I go on Box and Dropbox to access various files, to make updates or changes. I go on GitHub to comment on a pull request or make some commits of code on my own. I go on Overleaf and Google Scholar to write some reports, look up some citations. And this all repeats over and over until at some point I turn on some sort of streaming site to watch a TV show or a movie. I get on Zwift, an online platform to go biking. And at some point then, I record what I have eaten for the day. I have a bad habit of not eating enough protein, so I'm tracking that specifically. Kind of unwind the day with my knitting, go on Ravelry to find a new pattern, and maybe if I completed one, I might post it on Instagram. So I tell you all this because this is all the data that is collected on various devices, and that is just alone of like what is collected, and that gives you this glimpse of my very personal story of each day. And this is actually an assignment that I give my students. I tell them from the moment they wake up to the moment they go to bed, they must keep a diary of exactly how much information is being collected on these different devices and different apps. Afterwards, they will reflect on what is recorded and then dig into one of the privacy policies of how their data is being collected. And so often enough, they do this, and then they find that the privacy policy is something like this. It's actually not that private. They find out that it's called a privacy policy, but basically says that the data is going to be used in ways that you've not thought or agreed to. Actually, one student in particular decided to dig into the credit card company that she used and found out that the privacy policy said that if you use their service, all your data, they can sell it to third-party entities or data brokers. And then she's like, well, that's not good. Maybe I need to switch to a different credit card company. Looked at other credit card companies. They all have the same policy. And so at some point during the class discussion, she exclaims, I need to eat. Because the fact is that a lot of restaurants now don't take cash. They only take cards. So at some point you're wondering like, wow, why are we willingly giving up all this information about ourselves that could be used potentially against us? And so it's actually because of the tension of we are giving information for some goods, and in particular in the government, we give it up for a public good. So here's a different example here that it's kind of timely, even though this article in particular was made written, March of 2020, which talks about how some of these colleges are requiring students to download an app that will track them on campus. And so the purpose was like maybe helping professors would have giant lecture halls where there's hundreds of students. And so the app will let the professor know who has been attending classes, who are late, or who have not been coming entirely. Other ideas about linking that data would be to like libraries and resources. I actually talked to some university librarians recently, and some places are talking about like, well, wouldn't it be great to know if students who excel and do really well in their programs, like what kind of resources were they using, which books were they checking out, were they using other programs around campus? But that's pretty invasive. I just told you my typical day across like all these different apps. Unless you can link all that, like you wouldn't know that. But what if it is on campus? That could have been easily done. So that could be very invasive. But what is the good then besides trying to make sure that the student gets the resources they need to succeed? Well, unfortunately, more recently, we've heard about the active shooting at Florida State University. So one of the ideas for the apps is that as soon as an active shooter comes on campus, the student will get a notification and say that the closest safe building to you is this one, go to there, and then their emergency contacts would be notified if they're safe or not. data is used across all these different entities, and especially in government. And so another way to think about tracking data is that FEMA uses the data to figure out how to do emergency evacuations. So again, location can be very invasive because like, I don't want the government to know where I'm at all the time, but it is important for in cases of hurricanes or of wildfires, especially what happened in LA County. And then I also kind of think of my mother-in-law who lives in a very remote area of Idaho. When I say very remote, I mean it's very, very remote. Like they get snowed in all the time. And I would really like FEMA to go rescue my mother-in-law, right? So knowing where she's located is super important, and also across other remote areas. And so we have this kind of weird question here. It's like, at what point do we sacrifice our personal privacy for public good? And so this is going to be the theme throughout my talk, is that there is this tension, and we have to consider the overall data governance of our data and how it is used for public good, and making sure that we are responsibly represented in that data. So going into how data is considered, there's other aspects like we need to think about the security, as I mentioned earlier, like are we saving it somewhere? Is it like hacker gonna go into it or not? Think about the privacy, thinking about like not that privacy policy I showed you earlier, like an actual one where the stalls are blackened and not glass. And then thinking about the ethics of it, because then there also could be situations where it is private, it is secure, but is it ethical for us to collect that data or share it? And so oftentimes we think of data as people, but it could be our businesses or communities, or thinking about as resources as well. Now, I kind of hinted at this before, but let's dig into why it's really important to think about all those areas and the data governance in general. So here's just some screenshots of some news articles of some events where one of these areas failed. So actually, just last week, apparently Hertz got their customer service data hacked. So that's a security flaw here. I just talked about the fact that a lot of the services that we use, like on our phones, like using the credit card companies or other kind of consumer data, like when you guys go to the grocery store and get those like, ooh, I get a discount on this, on, I don't know, beer, baby diapers, I don't know what, okay, anyway, whatever you buy on there, like your information is being shared. And so there's not much privacy here. So there's some articles about how, even though you don't consent to it, your information is being used. And also think about the ethics. A lot of people don't know that during World War II, Census Bureau data was used to identify Japanese Americans and put them into internment camps. So this is a failure on thinking about the ethics of the data. So I mentioned earlier at the very beginning that I'll be talking about also the life cycle of that data and themed around that governance there. So I think about data as having a story and then making sure that story has an ending. So here you can think about life cycle where we can start from the collection all the way to the destruction and archival. So let's start with the collection here and thinking about overall governance and protection of that data. So many people are familiar with census, I think, hopefully, at least in this room because we're in DC. For those who don't know, every 10 years we try to count every person where they are on April 1st. And so these are the two different census questions during the 1980 on the left, and then on the right, the 2020. So if we go over on the 1980, when you go to the question about what is the race and ethnicity of the person, it says fill one circle for blank person. And so you have all these different options, but here, I would actually really struggle how to answer this. For those who don't know, I am half Chinese, half Korean. And like evenly split. I'm like not one or the other. My father's from Hong Kong. My mom is from South Korea. So I don't know how evenly split one could be, right? Like I'm just like right there. So which one do I fill in? I don't know. But then the 2020 census here, you got checkboxes. You can fill things in. There's like a lot of options here. So how you present the questions to collect the data really does impact like downstream uses. So actually, this is a diagram that I had in my book I published in 2021, and I collected this information trying to compare like Washington, D.C. with Wyoming, because I have family back in Wyoming, and I always find it funny that there's more people in the district than there are in the whole state of Wyoming. And just kind of looking at the race ethnicity background here. So this is from collected data from the American Community Survey back in 2019 when I was trying to make this diagram. And actually, I decided like, well, how much would this change here now that we've updated our questions? So it changed quite a bit. It now reports multiracial. And it actually has shifted here for Wyoming on how they're counting people here. So how we present the questions and how we collect it does have impacts on like what we can analyze and what we present. And so some of you might be thinking like, do you actually really need to know how many Asian Americans are in Wyoming? Probably not Wyoming, but it is important in some places like Washington, D.C. or New York City, because different Asian Americans have different poverty rates depending on which subpopulation they're part of. And that is important to figure out how you can use that data to figure out like what programs to help those individuals. And so it gets into even in a trickier situation. I just said like, hey, this is how we're collecting data, but what if you don't collect the right data at all? What happens then? So there's actually a survey methodologist over at the University of Michigan. Her name is Sung-Hyun Lee. She was looking at different surveys across the United States on asking Asian Americans like various various questions about their household and their income and other aspects. And so the things that came out from these different surveys, she found that Asian Americans are born in America, speak English, and highly educated, which I guess that's me, but I'm not representative of all Asian Americans, right? And you want to let's dig in this deeper. Like, why are all these major national surveys saying this? And then you think about it, like, what languages do we usually give surveys in? English and Spanish. So you're missing an entire population of people who are Asian American, but they don't speak English or Spanish, and so they're not being captured on these surveys. So this actually goes into this interesting media piece. I don't know if some people might know this through, I think it was the Data Feminism book, is like when I first learned about it. So it's a mixed media piece where it's called a library of missing data sets. And so it's a filing cabinet, you open it up and you look at, there's different folders labeled with different kind of questions that would be great to answer. It's like people excluded from public housing because of criminal records, all the way down to a master database that details if and which Americans are registered to in multiple states. And all these questions would be really great to answer. And then you open up that folder and find nothing. And it's because there's literally no data that could answer these questions. So that's why it's called the Library of Missing Data Sets. Occasionally, the curator the artist who has created this piece will update it saying like sometimes there has been data that has now answered the question. And so I have my students do the same thing. I'm like, hey, this is the list currently. Did you find any data? And then I talk through why they can't find data for it. And so last time we did this last summer, the list of questions we haven't been able to answer, so we're going to keep trying. And so that gets into the question of like, if you don't collect the data, that means that there's no issues, right? Which is not, great. And so it comes into the fact that like, if there is no data, then you can't tell a story, and therefore there can't be any change. And so you never go back to thinking that we need to collect the data. So that's on data collection and acquisition here. So now we're going to move into, okay, maybe we did collect the data correctly. We've thought through this very thoughtfully, and now we got to figure out how we're going to store all this information, which can be physical or digital. So I always think about the security aspects. Many of us have to go to security training. It's like you can't walk away from your computer. Make sure you lock everything up, right? And also physical storage. I mean, I used to work at Los Alamos National Lab where we did have physical data, and so you had to lock it up in a safe. I did have a designated safe, guys, and it was very intense, and I had to like wind it all up with the little knob thing and everything. It felt like back in, I don't know, those old movies and things. Anyways, so there's different ways to store information, but then we have to think about like how we do populate it. So a lot of students in particular, like, you know, when we're teaching students, we have to start with a nice clean data set, and so they're all like, oh, it's like the iris, or now I've been told it's the penguins data set. Like everything's like, oh, it's nice and neat and clean. And really data is not. It's very messy. So when we do think about storage, we have to think of how we make it actually tidy and readable, and other people who like maybe didn't part of the collection process, but then are coming in later, can they understand what's going on? So this is really important, but then there are also issues of like, well, even if the best intentions on collecting data, there could be other kind of issues. So I actually do ask my students to go through like, what if your data looks like in the top left corner? Like, how would you clean this? And some of them are pretty obvious ways to clean the data, which you can look at the bottom right, but then you get to the very bottom name, which is Anne Marie, with a hyphen between. And so you get into these weird areas of like, well, is Anne Marie the first name, or is Marie the last name, or what's going on here? And so sometimes you have to make a judgment call of like, actually, how are we going to store this information for other people to analyze later? But then we can go into the whole like, well, what if there's no information at all and we still have a question we need to ask because like we missed it on the collection side, or maybe there's a law against collecting that data. So actually at the Urban Institute, we have credit bureau data, but most of the time it's aggregated or it's missing some values like race and ethnicity. But it's really important to get that information because we want to look at like home ownership gaps or how race and ethnicity impacts credit screenings or for hiring. And so then it gets into the question of like, well, again, how do we get that information? So actually RAND has a method called the Bayesian improved surname geocoding. You don't need to know the actual name, but it is a method where they call impute or create values based on the surname of the individual and the location they're at, and figuring out like, can we then add race and ethnicity into this credit bureau data? And so there is a report from Urban Institute where we use that method and see if it helps us do the analysis we want to do later on. Now, this sounds really good, but we also have to think about like what are the implications when we implement certain methods because they could be very biased. So I just said the Bayesian improved surname geocoding, this method relies on your last name and where you're located. So we're going to use me as an example again because apparently I'm a great example. I am Claire McKay Bowen, and I grew up in Salmon, Idaho. So what is the probability that I would be a white female? Pretty high, right? So that's what I would probably be. And so then my representation as an Asian American in a remote part of Idaho would be entirely erased or changed. So knowing that these methods have been used is really important when we put it into what's called the metadata and making sure that it follows the FAIR principles, which are making sure the data is findable, accessible, interpretable, and reusable. So just storing the data isn't enough. We actually should know how it was collected, how was it altered, was there other things that we did to clean it up? That all should be documented. So when we talk to people about like, let's collect this data, it should be let's collect the data and the data dictionary with it, right? Like we really need to make sure that the information around it should be associated with that data, and again, following the FAIR principles here. Because searching for the right data can be very problematic, as we can see from the image on the right. That's kind of sometimes it feels like when I'm trying to find the right data, it's like, oh, geez, it's maybe over here, or maybe a piece over here, or maybe here, and then you spend several hours, and then you become a very sad person and try to find some ice cream to make you feel better. That's what I do. So it comes into this point of like preserving the data to preserve the story, and the right story, right? Right, hopefully. So now we're going into the data sharing and transfer aspect. Like, how do we make sure that we're safely and securely sharing this information with other people? And so we're just going to go through like two processes that typically happen. Many in the audience probably knows these processes, but we're going to do this for those who are less familiar. So typically you get data access in two ways: through a secure enclave or secure data access. The other one's public. So we're going to start with the secure data access. So this is like the direct or restricted access part. So sometimes it is like you get a government laptop or you go to a physical facility. The physical facilities are often the Federal Statistical Research Data Centers or the National Institute of Health, like supported data repositories, those places to get direct access. Then they also usually pair it up with some background checks to make sure that don't let any person to access the data. And then also making sure that you promise not to do anything bad with that data. So that's why you kind of sign your life away with some sort of three-letter acronym thing: data use agreement, data non-disclosure agreement, memorandum of understanding, memorandum of agreement, and all the different ways you sign your life away. Anyways, so that's one way to access data. The other one is the public data files or ton of statistics, and that's what people are more familiar with, especially with government data. They'll see like a table on a website, and they see the summary of statistics for a particular group. A very popular one that usually people's top of mind is unemployment rate. That is a statistic that gets published monthly, right? So those are things that get released publicly. So usually when I try to talk to people about like this process, I use this kind of image here where you have a layer of users. Users can be people in your community, it could be politicians, it could be other statisticians who are like, hey, these are the analyses I want to do. I need access to that data. And so we kind of capture what kind of like uses the data might have, and then there's like that me in the middle, some privacy expert that kind of works with somebody who owns the data. So we sometimes call them the data curator or the steward. Ultimately, it's the person who's responsible for the data, sometimes the one who collected data, but again, they're usually responsible for the safeguard of that data. privacy expert and the data carrier will work together to figure out what statistics should be highlighted in whatever release later on. In statistics, we call this statistical disclosure control or limitations. So some method that may alter the data just like enough to protect the individuals, businesses, or other entities in that data, but still make sure that it's usable for the purpose that was asked by the users. And so it leaves that data privacy layer in the form of summary tables or statistics. So actually an example of one is the CDC Wonder. It's like interactive table where you can look at mortality rates by the county. It also could be microdata. So I put a little asterisk here because then you're trying to highlight certain aspects of the data, but you still want to smooth things out because you don't want somebody to be identifiable in the data or a business in the data. So there are pros and cons on these two different ways to get that access to data or getting shared to you. So like on the secure access, it's very secure. I just said you had to get a background check and you have to go to a specific facility. And once you go there, you can't bring your phone sometimes, or you can't take down notes or anything. Anything that comes out has to be reviewed. So it's very, very private, very secure, but super inaccessible, because some of these places you have to physically drive to. So some of you might be thinking like, where, Claire? Like there's over, like I think now we're up to 34 federal statistical data centers. I look in the audience and thinking, because we have one now in Puerto Rico, so I think we're up to 34. Anyways, so that's quite a few across the nation, one now in Puerto Rico. So Claire, where is yours? Okay, so I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico. That is the state capital of New Mexico. So you think the closest one should be pretty close, right? Right? No, it's Boulder, Colorado. That's a 7-hour drive for me. So yeah, maybe urban will cover my time and gas to go drive up there and to access the data that way, but that's not accessible for other people. Do they have the resources to do this? Because this is all their data too, right? It's everybody's. Like, so a community-based organization should be able to access the data as well if they have a purpose for it, but they may not have the means to do so. Also, some of these places require, some of the data sets require a full clearance and be a US citizen. So that also eliminates a lot of people who can access the data. And it can take a very long time because as somebody like myself who's gone through 5 different clearances, I'm not kidding you, 5 different ones, still takes months or years to get through them all. So it's not very easy to be rapidly responding to certain situations. The other side, though, then you're like, okay, if secure access is not the way to go, then what about public files and statistics? So it's the opposite, right? It's very accessible. It can be on a website. You can just download the data. It would be great. You're like, yay, I can do the analyses without weird secure enclave stuff. Well, the cons being that it has been altered for privacy. So sometimes some of the variables have been like aggregated is some of the term, or coarsened to the point that's not useful for whatever analysis you want to do. Like I just talked about the credit bureau data from the previous section, and that didn't have some race and ethnicity data that some of my colleagues needed for making public policy decisions here. And so in these cases, it doesn't become as useful as you hope. And so you might be wondering, like, well, has these problems been existing more recently, or has always existed? It has existed for a very, very long time. It's just really hard to figure out what is that balance between the privacy of the individual and making sure it is a public good. We kind of went through that in the very beginning of this talk where I gave you those different scenarios, but it gets really tricky when we dig in even deeper because we're trying to figure out, like, who are the groups that we are trying to make sure they're properly represented in that data. It's really hard when they're rural communities. I just said making sure that I'm represented in Salmon, Idaho is really hard. For those who don't know, Salmon, Idaho is a population of just over 3,000. It's the biggest town in a county the size of Connecticut. So that's really tough to make sure that I'm still representing that data, but then also still protected. It's also thinking about then, like, what are the risks or the privacy violations that could be used against me in the data? Or what are the different use cases? It's really tough because there's so many data sets out there, and there's so many different ways that each of us are thinking about what is privacy means to you, what is secure to you, what is useful to you, right? All those, if I asked each person just in this audience what they think about privacy and what they think is useful about the data, we would all have different answers. Especially with really big data sets, it's going to be hard to capture all the possible use cases. So one of my favorite examples is that the census, like the decennial census, the one that we count every single person on April 1st, where they were, like a snapshot of our country every 10 years. So of course, top of mind, people are thinking like, oh, we need to know for the number of people in each state for the congressional seats, or how do we do voting lines? But you never think about, let's say, apparently there's a county in Ohio that uses that data to figure out how many restaurant permits they allocate. So that's not something that Census Bureau is thinking about, but it is a use case that is used for this data. And so again, it's really hard to capture everything that somebody might use the data for. And then finally, communicating the constraints and limitations of different methods to get access to the data. So some people will seize onto like one kind of method or one kind of framework and say, like, this is the answer for everything. This is the way to go forward. But not realizing that it's not a silver bullet. There's a lot of different, there's so many different data, there's so many different uses, and trying to balance all the different trade-offs that for people's needs and certain privacy protections, and then also thinking about the legal framework, which I'll go into in a little bit here. And so, and very simplistically, here's a way to kind of think about like that, again, the tension between the privacy and usefulness, or security and usefulness of that data. So right now, you don't know what I'm going to show you on the right, right? You have no idea what that image is. So that's very private, right? Very private. You have no idea. But it's not very useful at all. So in this case, here's this extreme of very private, but not useful. So I'm going to try to release some information to you, right? Just a little bit. So now you have a better idea, some colors, maybe some rough shapes. So less private, because now you have some idea, but then not very useful still, right? So let's change this up a little bit. Okay, again, clear picture. Still not great, right? But then at some point, we might crank it up and say like, okay, here's the image right now. So very useful. You know every single detail. You know, like, oh, it's flowers in a vase. Very pretty. I like these colors. Is it private anymore? No. So right now, I did it kind of like a linear aspect, but it's actually more like a spaghetti monster thing where you're trying to figure out like exactly how to balance that trade-off between making sure that whatever information you're going to be sharing with people is still useful for whatever application they have, but then still private for certain purposes, right? So it gets really, really tricky there. So then moving on into then the analysis. Okay, so hopefully we figured out like how we properly collect data, how we kind of altered and stored it, and then transferred it over to the people. Now they got to start analyzing and exploring, interpreting, and finding insights from the data. This is like usually the fun part, right? Like, let's go, let's do this. So, and then another fun assignment I give my students. So you guys get a sneak peek of all the weird assignments I give my students here. So I ask them, hey, I give them a question, and then I say, find two answers that are different, but they are statistically correct. So it's interesting because you have questions like, at what age are women less likely to get pregnant, all the way down to what is the primary factor that causes homelessness. So these are all very important questions that we're trying to answer in our nation, given certain conditions right now going on. And it's funny because then my students find out exactly why are they getting different answers, and pretty quickly. So we'll go with the first question, which is at what age are women less likely to get pregnant? So the student who got this last year, he exclaimed that what frustrated him the most was the fact that one data set did not account for the health of the mother. It just went straight looking at all these individuals, just collecting information about them, and didn't look into whether or not the mother was smoking or had a history of like breast cancer or any other illnesses, whereas another data set did. And they both presented very different answers to answer this one question here. And he was really frustrated because it is like we have declining birth rates going on in the United States, and this is something we need to be thinking about. And so we kind of get to a situation where then like, well, there are lies, there are damn lies, and there are statistics. So this is like a very famous quote, right? But it's true, right? Statistics can be framed differently. Like I just said, we can get two different data sets. You can report the statistics about them. They would be the quote unquote truth, but we have to think of the context of what is being analyzed here. So another thing is to then think about like how it's being reported out. So this is kind of getting into a little bit of the dissemination piece, which is the next part of the cycle, but there's still an analysis behind it before you start reporting. And so you need to dig in a little bit more to figure out exactly where are the sources for these news stories. So like, are the claims made in an article apply to your life, your community, or your families, right? Because sometimes an article will make a claim, but the data is only applied to a certain subpopulation, so it wouldn't apply to you at all. You got to think about who is doing the analysis, right? So who authored this article? Do they have anything in the background that's influencing what they're reporting? You also have to think about, is there anything else like red flags, doubts, just like the student who said, well, one data set looked into the health of the mother, actually more specifically, whereas another data set didn't. And then what would happen if you increase or decrease the available data? Because that could also change the story very drastically. So this last piece here I'm going to zone in on, because it was interesting during the pandemic, there was some interesting articles that came out when data was not at a certain level. So I don't know if you guys remember back in 2020 when we had the pandemic, everybody and their dog was making some sort of dashboard about what was going on with social distancing, right? And so there was one in particular that got really popular that said like A+ DC, which District of Columbia, yeah, you guys got all get A+ on social distancing. It was like Maryland, Virginia, yeah, the whole area. Good job, guys. But then back in my home state of Idaho and the surrounding states, we all got Fs because we were not social distancing there. But when I was looking into which data they were actually using, it was aggregated at the county level. So I just told you that where I grew up in Salmon, Idaho was the size of Connecticut. So let's actually go through this process here. So I did live in Arlington, Virginia for a little bit, and I was working here at Urban Institute. And so before the lockdown, I would say in an average week, I was traveling about 70 miles, like, commuting back and forth. This is actually the bike path I took to get to Urban Institute. And I also accounted for going to the grocery store and then other things, and like maybe the occasional weekend where I was going to see museums, because that was one of my goals while I was temporarily living in DC, was go to as many Smithsonians as I could. So this was my travel time. During the lockdown, it went down to 1 mile. So the specific area of Arlington I was living at was actually Pentagon City, and actually the grocery store was like literally just down from the block from my apartment. So I distinctly remember this, like the first day of lockdown, I came to the grocery store at 6 a.m. because I didn't want to see anybody and I wanted to make sure I had coffee. So I grabbed all my coffee and then I locked myself away for the whole week because I had enough food otherwise, because at the time I thought this was only for 1 week, so I just needed coffee. So that was my travel time right after the lockdown. Now going back to Salmon, Idaho. So I lived in Salmon, Idaho. I actually lived in the countryside of it, which most people did, but not the heart of the city, town. Okay. Anyways, so it was about 5 miles. So I would also bike because I didn't want to, there was no bus that came in. So I would bike to school and bike back. So that's 10 miles round trip. We occasionally, sometimes I didn't bike. I had to take my truck because I had a truck and take it to the local grocery store. So you're wondering, like, where is this 300 plus miles coming from? So the grocery store only had certain things. So for those of you who never lived in a very rural area, you did like this monthly pilgrimage to the closest like Costco. Like, big deal. So Costco was in Missoula, Montana. There was also no sales tax out there, so usually my mother and I got our SUV. Sometimes you got a trailer and you go over there, you fill up that SUV, even to the point where I distinctly remember I had something on my lap and I was like, trying to hold everything that we bought. We do that once a month. Okay, so if that week happened to be the time that we went to go to Costco and get all the things, that was before lockdown, it would have been about 350 miles. During lockdown, if it happened to be the week that we went to Costco, because that was an essential trip, right? It went down to 300 miles. So I'm not saying that this is specifically the reason why those dashboards got it wrong, but it does paint a different story when you actually think about the fact that the data was being reported at the county level. And maybe one of the reasons why it was only reported at the county level is because of privacy and security reasons. But it does paint a different story. So in here, we're seeing that we're changing the statistics will change that story. Okay, now we're going to dissemination. So we were borderline there, and now we're deeply going into this topic here of like thinking about how we properly disseminate information. So sometimes when we disseminate information, it's really dictated about what privacy laws and regulations are there. So unlike some places in the United States, we have dozens of different laws and regulations at the federal level, and then let alone the fact that each state has their own different laws and regulations. So it makes it really tricky on how you are going to do all that full data collection, storage, all the way down to dissemination of that information that abides to all these different laws. And so here is a screenshot from IAPP. It's a privacy group. And this is, I looked it up, it was just, April 7th. So this is pretty recent. And this is the current state then for the different states here. And so you can imagine that it gets really, really tricky about trying to figure out which data set is okay to share with another maybe potential state. So actually that's one of my projects, is figuring out like how some states might share with each other, but they have very different regulations. And so there's different interpretations too, and the lawyers all sometimes don't agree. So yeah, it gets really messy. So trying to figure that all out on top of like which method are you going to use to release data. So this is a screenshot from a table that was published from the National Academies of Sciences, the Committee on Statistics, looking at like, okay, there's different levers here. You have the law lever, you also have to think about the harms that might happen with the data, but they also have to think about against the public good. So we don't need to read through this full diagram here, but just to walk you through, from left to right is increasing of risks for releasing the information. So like potential harms from something that's negligible all the way to life-threatening. From top to bottom here, we are looking at the potential usefulness of that data. So if the top being like, it has a major policy impact, it could help a lot of people in very positive ways, all the way down to something like, it'd be really educational, it'd be great to share for students. And so thinking about the technical aspects of sharing information, to analyze it properly, to make sure it's disseminated, should also be paired with some sort of like policy solution, and thinking about like how the laws are interpreted to make sure that we safely allow the access to the data to do certain statistics. And so one of the examples I really like was a data set that was released by the Department of Education in collaboration with the IRS. So the college scorecard is what it's called. It's a dashboard here that releases information to help students and their families, or potential students and their families, to look at different colleges of majors and the economic outcomes of certain students with those majors and other factors too. And so this is really great. So this data is really sensitive, but has a huge impact on helping families like myself, where I'm actually a first-generation college student. So talking to my parents about which college I should go to doesn't really work out. So I wish something like this existed when I was a kid. So I could have known like where I could go and what was the potential impacts for like if I decided to actively pursue another university. I just went to the closest one to me because it made sense, and it was also really cheap back then. But if I had this, I would have maybe known that I would maybe take a little bit more of a risk, because I could see like the economic outcome of taking a certain major would have been helpful, and I could help my family. But now you're wondering, okay, so this is very useful, but there could have been some harm, right? And so the level of harm that they considered on releasing this data was that it could be light altering, right? Because some students and families, like thinking about like mine, where knowing that I was going to pursue a career to help my family, it's life altering was the level. And so some of the data from this dashboard was actually suppressed or removed, because to protect the privacy or to ensure privacy of that data, some of the values got kind of like jittered or kind of like a little noisy, but some of it's really noisy because it's too identifiable. And so at that point, then there's too much uncertainty. We shouldn't report it, because again, it could be life altering for those individuals who are looking at this data. So the other aspect is to think about, when we disseminate information and being responsible about this, is also thinking about like, how are you going to communicate this? So actually this is a diagram that's created by the Urban Institute in one of the books that they published, thinking about like layers of communication. So on the far right, it's like the size of audience. So if you really want a broad audience, then like thinking about the depth of research, it should be like maybe social media, right? So it's like depth of research is very little. You're just going to say, hey, cool thing happened here. Check out this website, go, right? All the way down to like some of us who are research statisticians, you're like, yeah, that technical paper that goes into the math, that's really, really cool, which is only really cool to maybe only a few people in this audience. So that means then the citing audience is very small. So we definitely need to think about carefully like how we are going to communicate at different mediums because of the different level of research to make sure we hit the certain audiences. Now that sounds really obvious. You're like, yeah, Claire, of course. Like if I want like a really broad audience, I would just make a little post on social media. It's totally fine. But we also have to consider what is that particular audience, not just the size of it. So something I definitely learned here working at Urban Institute is that when you say, hey, I want to engage a lay audience, everybody in the comms department at Urban will be like, okay, what do you mean? Do you mean like your family members, or do you mean like community-based organizations, or a politician, or is it the state level, or is it a local level? Is it a tribal person, or somebody in Congress? Oh, wait a minute, is it somebody who's going to advocate for whatever reasons? Or are they other researchers, but they're just outside your field? And like, you can think of it going on and on and on. So we have to be very thoughtful exactly what we mean by a lay audience, or any of the ones in between, from that broader one down to the smaller point, because even down there, I have to think, when I released a statistical paper that was very technical, I was like, okay, the audience is statisticians, or is it economists? Because I publish in economic journals as well. And so that's a very different way of how I should phrase things in that paper. And so we have to be careful, because when you try to give a data story for everyone, it becomes something for no one. So we're getting to the final part of this data lifecycle, thinking about the destruction and archival aspects of that data. And so when I come to this point, I actually do have an image of my spouse with a hammer with some of our hard drives and going at it, because we were moving across the country and we were trashing those hard drives. And so this is actually a legitimate way to physically destroy your data. You can, of course, digitally destroy it. You have to do multiple deletes and make sure it's not saved somewhere else. But my spouse was like wanted to be extra sure nobody was getting any information from our old hard drives, so he did take a hammer and smash our hard drives. And this is technically a legit way to destroy data. But now, like, broadly thinking about it, you need to think about, so all the way from the collection aspect, should we tell our participants that their information will be eventually deleted, right? It's actually technically one of our rights, especially over in Europe. It's the right to be forgotten. So something that you agree 10 years ago, you might not agree to now. And so shouldn't that data have been deleted, or have some measures to be thought of to be deleted? And so how do you make sure that you inform participants without scaring them away from participating from the data collection? And so that's whole aspect of thinking about the transparency. And that's been a big thing for research right now, is how transparent we are with our methods and our approach, and how we think about other uses of data. The other thing is that, is there situations where it would be unethical, actually, to delete data? I just said that 10 years ago, you probably don't want some of your information collected, but maybe it's important to just keep it and archive it in some form. So there's actually some research that was done here at Urban some years ago about, like, some subgroups are just researched over and over and over again, because some of that data does get deleted. And so it does wear on some of those subgroups, thinking like, why am I being researched again? Like, why am I doing this again? Don't you already have this information? So it's saving resources and also avoiding fatigue for those individuals being part of that. And so you have to think about, like, well, will this like cause other kind of harms because you're overly engaging in certain groups? Then finally, like, thinking about, if you do destroy it, again, would it disproportionately impact some of those subpopulations? And so sometimes in that case, you just have to engage with them and say, like, hey, here are the trade-offs of keeping the data versus not, right? And you have to have those conversations ongoing all the time, because landscape changes, viewpoints change, and so on. So I'm going to end here in thinking that the data may end, but as statisticians, our role will always continue, because we do have many, many stories to tell. But I just said in the very beginning about what happens if you don't have data. You can't tell a story, and therefore can't have an action. So it's unfortunate that in the last couple months, a lot of our federal data has been taken down. And if they do come up, they have been altered. And so it does impact on how we tell our stories and how we as statisticians are involved. And the thing is that traditionally we're very quiet. We're actually not as engaged as we should be. And it's really frightening, because like, we really should be engaged. We do tell the stories. Like, we are reporting the statistics, and we should get as involved as possible. And this goes back to what I said before, because the data should be publicly available, because it is about us. It's of the people. We are part of it. It is our communities. It is our businesses. It is our resources. It is by the people, because it is our taxpayer dollars that we told Congress, yes, use this money to collect this information for our communities and our nation. And it is for the people, because we said we wanted these data to be collected because we wanted certain public goods. I want somebody to come rescue my mother-in-law in remote Idaho. I want to have access to wonderful parks that I can go to, or know that there are food resources for me. So instead of driving all the way to Missoula, Montana, to get my food, right, is for all of us. And so we need to shine a light on our data. We as statisticians need to do this, or else our stories will die in darkness. So I will end this with saying that it is now more than ever, we need to shine, or should shine, a light on our profession. We must increase our visibility and embody our mission of promoting the practice and profession of statistics. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Claire. Some water.
Oh, yeah. Water's good.
I bet. So when we began to conceptualize this Dionne Price Public Lecture, one of the things that we thought about in particular was how important it was to Dionne that people understand the way that statistics impacts them in aspects of their life that they couldn't possibly imagine. So I think it's clear from Claire's inaugural lecture that there are a lot of examples of this, and Claire, you've done an outstanding job of sharing with us. So you have the opportunity now to ask questions of Claire. You can ask them, we'll bring, Mara and Emily will have microphones to come around to you so that you can ask questions. For those of you online, or here if you're shy, although I know many of you, and shy isn't the word I would normally associate with you, you can go to this this QR code or directly type in the bit.ly address and drop some questions into this Google Doc, which I just happen to have handy here on this iPad. So let's start first, and please, if you're in the online audience, please do submit questions, and many of you have already. So but let's start and see if anyone in the room would like to be the first to ask Claire a question. All right, so Lissa has a question. Yes, that would be preferable, yeah.
I'm having trouble with the QR code.
All right.
That was a wonderful talk, and I certainly loved your closing quote from Dionne when she was president of ASA. So, quick question. You give your personal data, maybe even your DNA, to a company, and you are confident it's securely stored, and then the company goes out of business or sells the data. What are your rights as the giver of the data? And I'm thinking about 23andMe.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is a process for you to request that data be eliminated. There's actually a great little short blurb that New York Times in particular wrote up that you could follow the steps. It's like 7 or something of them. I remember looking this up briefly. I actually didn't use 23andMe, so I didn't dig into it deeper, but they go through on how to request it being removed before they get sold and the data be used in other ways. So this is my, it's great that you brought this up. So for those of you who have used 23andMe, you should follow that 7 step process and get your data removed from the database. Now, in terms of like what protections you have, that gets really murky again because it really depends on where you live, frankly, because where you live determines like what laws protect you. And so one thing I really want to highlight as well, and I'm again glad you brought this up, is that people are like, well, what about HIPAA? It's like health data, right? Shouldn't that be protected? I think people forget the I in HIPAA is insurance, so it only protects health insurance data. So things like, even I just showed you Garmin, like I wear a Garmin watch. I'm a very active, avid endurance cyclist and triathlete, and that data being collected is not protected under HIPAA. So that's actually a question I do ask my students, like true and false questions. I go through like a bunch of them and see like how many of them will answer, and they always miss that one. They think HIPAA protects their fitness data, and it doesn't. So that was my long way of saying like it really depends on where you are and what protections you have, but there's also a general call out that in the United States, we really do need a consumer data privacy law, and we currently don't still.
Thanks, Claire. Other questions in the room? Jenny, we'll bring you a microphone. Yep.
I don't know if this is so much a question or a comment, and I'm going to start with the obligatory and honest. Claire, I loved your talk. I was looking at your data cycle over and over, and I kept thinking the one piece as someone who worked with survey data for so many years was the missing data part. Mm-hmm. You know, and you have an analysis part with the missing data, and you have an analysis part after you treat it, and an analysis part after you do some privacy protection. But one thing that sort of sprung to mind with that is there are so many reasons for missing data. Sometimes there are the questions that people just don't answer at random, right? I just don't feel like answering it. Some of them are very, very sensitive, and some of them are very, very sensitive and won't be answered because of a perceived lack of protection, a perceived danger. And I think that's an important piece to add to this story that the data, particularly the federal data, are telling right now. The other thing I wanted to mention, and this is, I keep thinking I need a question in here, is that the way we collect data may have changed as well. For several organizations, you used to have non-binary as one of your possible options for, you know, how do you describe yourself? That's not allowed anymore. And one option that we're getting is, well, just don't count those, or we'll impute something that's not non-binary over there, and somewhere we'll just drop the data, and that adds its own bias. So that's something else to think about.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought it up. I was thinking about like how I might include things into my talk, and of course it got too big, and so I had to drop some things. But I'm glad you brought this up because there was actually an incident like specifically about the non-binary. So like Facebook did a survey some years ago where they collected about like from businesses. And one of the questions was like gender, and it actually gave a lot of different options. It was like male, female, cisgender, non-binary, all these other things. And then when they published the data, it said male, female, or other. And so that goes back to kind of the heart of your question, which is like trust and also making sure that it's secure and being represented. So I think if I was participating in that data, if I was told very beginning that like, hey, we're collecting this data, we want to make sure you're represented, but because of privacy concerns, maybe later on, if we don't get enough information, we might have to suppress, or however their language is. I think I would feel much better than at the end knowing that like, oh, I'm in the other category, or wherever I decide to mark and go like, okay, I understand that they did that because of privacy purposes, but they didn't do that. And so actually there was some backlash for Facebook about like, why did you even bother collecting this information if I'm just not going to be represented in this data? And then that trust erodes, and then goes into that whole survey response rates issue, which could be because you're angry, or you're scared, or you're tired. I mean, there's some surveys I've seen that they're like, it will take what is it? One I looked at in particular, they asked 60 questions, and they said that it would happen in 45 minutes. I'm like, I don't think that's not gonna happen. So you're probably gonna have a drop off of like, people will start maybe at the first 10 and then nothing. So that's also something to be considered. But I say this, and I know Jenny, she's a great survey statistician, so I don't have to tell her this.
I always love that moment in surveys where you've answered a whole bunch of questions on a screen, and then you find out that, you know, you're 4% of the way done. That's a great encouragement to, you know, keep going. So let's take a question from the Google Doc. How do you think about privacy trade-offs combining remote sensing data with tabular person-level demographic data? Do you have any advice on how to use remote sensing data responsibly?
Oh, that's a great question. And I say that because I actually don't have very much experience with remote sensing data, but usually data that has a time or a location component makes it very hard to protect. So, because it's like frequency of things, right? So for just looking at something simple as space gets tricky because the example I like to give is that New York Times got a hold of some cell phone data, and just knowing lat and long location, they were able to identify somebody. That was it, because like it's obvious if they work at Microsoft because they're there during working hours. And then they changed their habits. So when changing habits make it distinctive, so the person went to Amazon campus one afternoon and then went back to Microsoft, and then a couple months later started going to the Amazon. And that was just enough for them to find who that person was and contact them on LinkedIn. So that was just location, right? You can't imagine like also adding the demographic information on top of it, because again, all you needed was that long. In terms of time, it gets also, if you just do like, I don't need a location, I just need to know time. So again, I've become a really good example for a lot of these things. So anyways, my example about myself is that I do a lot of like marathons and a lot of kind of endurance races. And so usually these races will put your participant information, they'll just put your first name, last name, age group, which are usually 5-year buckets, and then your home like state, because sometimes they like, look at all the states like participating in this race, right? And you're like, that's pretty innocent, whatever. A change in my last name from one race to another is I got married, right? Me changing the age group indicates exactly what my age is instead of a 5-year one. And if I changed my home state, then it shows that I moved. So you get this inferential information. So with sensor data, with some demographic, it gets really tricky because it's hard to, again, capture exactly what are the risks that somebody could infer about the data. And so that was not a good answer to say like how one would protect it. It's just some things to consider about protecting it. And again, I don't have much experience with it. So it could be one of those cases where you have to really alter location, or like I know some spatial methods are thinking about like instead of exact point, you do like a radius around that point and like randomly draw from it. That's one approach, but that gets tricky if they're taking a path. So you're trying to figure out what's like the most obvious maybe path between points that's in this radius. And then pairing with demographic, it gets really tricky.
Thanks. So I climb into my car at noon on a Sunday during football season, and my GPS will automatically, without my asking, give me directions to the Crystal City Sports Pub, which is quite likely where I'm heading, but that's also quite creepy.
Yeah, that's why what's a colleague's favorite example to give his students is that the reason why there are beer next to baby diapers is because of all those like times you scanned, like I want to get some bonus like codes from the grocery store. They found out that if you place beer closer to baby diapers, beer is going to be bought more. Yes.
Excellent. Okay, questions from in the room? Clarissa has one. And, okay, go ahead. Yeah, and then we'll get to you, Clarissa, okay?
Ooh, is it on? Hi, great talk. Thank you so much. You started to talk about your example of Microsoft and Amazon and then going on to LinkedIn to identify this human. And that's the thing that keeps me up at night, is that I can use all of the statistical disclosure limitation tools in my toolbox, but ultimately my data exists in a landscape that can be blended with data that I don't have anything to do with, that oftentimes my respondents are releasing on their own. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how the data exists in an ecosystem and what we can be doing about that, or what we should be thinking about.
Another good question. You guys are all really good at asking great questions, so appreciate that. So that is why what I sometimes call the more traditional methods have a hard time combating with the 10 years ago, or 10 years ago, the smartphones of then or today are more powerful than our desktops, right? Like that's one example I tell my students. Or the fact that like when I started college, there was a thing called Facebook, right? And we had no idea how that was going to explode. Or MySpace, which when I say MySpace, then my nieces and nephews give me a weird look and they don't know what that is. So, anyways, it's really tough to account for all the different things out there. And so you do try to do your best guess, but then maybe it's not enough. And so that's why there's other, in statistics, we call them statistical data privacy or statistical disclosure and control or limitation. More popularly, because computer scientists are way better at branding, it's privacy enhancing technologies or PETs. So more broadly, there's a concept called differential privacy that tries to account for like all the future threats and the current threats, but then you add more noise, right? So that gets back into that trade-off of like how much are you going to willingly like sacrifice your personal privacy or maybe the usefulness to make sure things are private. So that doesn't quite get into your question, but it is like we need to look through the full toolbox of different privacy enhancing technologies, figure out if it's the right way to pair it up with that, or even just say like, hey guys, this is the reality of things, like, do you want this public good? Actually, I think there was a medical journal that like surveyed, I'm pulling this out of my head, was a long time ago, so this is very vague, that surveyed people like during security breaches about their medical information, and that like what their perceptions were on it. And I think it was the whole, like, if they were told, like, hey, this data was going to be used for this, but they did these security measures, but it still failed. And, like, people were more okay with that versus knowing that it wasn't as secure or being as upfront about it, right? So it's just like, how much are you trying to do your best due diligence given the situation, and then say, like, well, this data was collected because we were trying to help you, right? And that's the element that I keep trying to stress. It's like, there is always going to be a risk, but we have to trade off with the good. And now I'm reminded of, like, even if you put the data in a secure bunker underneath, like, in the ground, unplugged to everything with the guards. I can't remember who that quote is from, but basically, even then, I don't think it's secure, right? So
Mara, Clarissa has a question, and but when you mentioned differential privacy, even from like 30 feet away, I could feel John twitch.
Okay, so this is coming from someone who has no clue about statistics, but it's twofold, and you kind of almost answered the second question. One, how are the census questions or even just the data questions developed? Who's the person that says, hey, let's find out this information about this, or, you know, so on and so forth. And then the second question.
I was like looking at the Census Bureau.
Oh, okay. Oh, really? Okay. And then, well, you want to answer me? No, we're going to have a chance. Oh, okay. And my second question is, I'm going to kind of piggyback on the previous question to some degree. In those cases where you have sent out this survey and the majority of the people didn't answer all of the questions, where does that information now fall in your results? Does it fall under other? Does it fall under no response? Does it fall under it's just not there? Is there, is there a generic place that information can now fall because it hasn't been answered?
Okay, these are tough questions. Now we're going to tough questions. Okay, well, I'm going to try to answer the first one, and I'm going to try my very best as people from the Census Bureau are staring at me. So it depends on which data set it is. There's several different data sets that the Census Bureau makes. They call them the products or data products. And so my understanding is that when they decide to change a question, it isn't like a light switch. They're like, hey, there's demand for this kind of question. Like a big deal was like solar panels and EVs, right? That was a thing that kind of shifted on some of the different data sets. And so it's like, is this important to ask? And especially because they have to think of like, well, that's another question to ask on a really long survey. And so there's testing that has to be done. And like, how do you present that question? And so like you do like cognitive tests or like ask different people, like, how do you interpret this question? Or should we reframe it? Or should we think about maybe like putting it into one survey versus another survey because like another survey is like too long. At some point, like at one point I was on the Census Scientific Advisory Committee, so I remember that question being coming up and being asked on that committee. So for those who don't know, the Census Scientific Advisory Committee at the time was a collection of people outside of government. It was industry and academia who have different backgrounds, and that people at the census could ask different questions and get external expert advice. And so when that kind of question came up, we sometimes will say like, well, you would need to consider maybe another data set that could help answer that question. Or did you think about maybe asking something else in complementary to that question? So that's another way to think about how those questions could be updated. And then we write them as recommendations. Now, the Census Bureau Director doesn't have to take our recommendations, but he has to, I say he, because the previous one was, he has to say yes or no, or it was like, we accept this recommendation, we partially recommendation, or we disagree, and say why. But then I was like, yeah, Rob Santos has to write something back to me, which I bring him up because he used to be my boss. So I like, you have to write back to me now. So there's that. And then to the other question about missing values and everything, it really depends on what that survey is and what the questions are. It gets really complicated because, I mean, that's why imputation or like trying to fill in data came about was because, I say came about, and clinical trials is a really great example. It's where you have people who are part of a trial and some of them drop out because they moved away or some of them pass away, right? And that data is still valuable because you try to get, like, to identify certain individuals to go through that trial is really timely and really expensive. And so imputing some of those values was, those methods came about from that. It's also because of survey responses as well. So there's those factors. It could be that you just have to clump it, but then it that's going to bias your results. So I can keep going on, but basically, it really does depend on that data set and stuff. And I will put this little asterisk next to it. I'm not a survey statistician. I am not. And I'm staring at people who are. And so my answers are probably insufficient. And so I'm looking at Jenny in particular, who is. Oh, well, now she has a question. She's like, Claire, you got this one thing wrong.
No,
we need to talk about that
I don't
more.
want to answer Chris's question. I'll talk to her over drinks. Probably Diet Coke. But I did finally think of my question because I was pontificating. So when I left, and it hasn't been that long ago that I left, the move was really towards data integration, combining multiple data sources.
That's great.
And I started thinking about the privacy implications of that because from an analytical perspective, I can fill in a lot of holes and I can get a much more complete picture of anybody. I mean, even from your very first picture. If I can buy some credit card data and some Garmin data and some GPS data and your census answer, maybe you answered to our population survey, I don't know if you were in that survey or not, I can put it all together on my data lake. Now I know a lot about you. A lot more than I would have if I just collected your survey or I just gotten your credit card data or, everything's protected, but I can kind of narrow it down. What do we do then? Because the possibilities here of getting really good information or really good analytical models are exponentially increasing. But the probability of doing some real damage in terms of privacy, I think, is increasing at the same rate.
So let me just follow up with that real quick, Jenny, to make sure, because I want to combine that with an online question. Okay, so Jenny, are you thinking about data sets across the federal?
I'm not just thinking, federal, private, whatever I buy, I can merge things together, merge data sets together.
Okay, so let's, while you're answering Jenny's question, also online, and by the way, the online questions are just as tough as the in-person
guys.
questions. But someone asked about the potential risks and outcomes of the administration's efforts to combine data sets across the various agencies where they've been kept separately before. So if we could put those things together.
Yeah. So actually that kind of matrix that I showed was actually in terms of data integration. So I'm glad that Jenny brought this up because obviously I spaced on answering the previous question is that's one way because some people are saying well, if survey response rates are declining, why don't we use administrative data and then try to combine them with other data sets so we can make more informed decisions. So there is very strong power with that. I just talked to a colleague in Kentucky who's looking at how can we combine certain data sets like SNAP or foster care or with education data with workforce data, things like that, because that could be really powerful. And it really hit me home when this individual talked about foster care because my mother is adopted. So it's how can we provide certain resources for these programs? But it gets really tricky because some data sets do have social security numbers and some of them don't. So that gets into a weird area of how do we properly do that? And that gets issues of do we do a probability linkage or do we try to link them on other aspects? Because particular things I'm just going to focus a little bit on the foster care system because I'm a little familiar given my mother. Some people just don't have their social security numbers recorded, and so you're just trying to track where they might be located by their address, which is not great in the foster care system, right? So that gets really tricky there. So there's that aspect. So that's not privacy. And in general, you're just trying to figure out how do you even make it accurate from that standpoint. And also the fact that every federal agency, if we're even just thinking about cross agencies trying to merge the data, they may have all different definitions of how they define demographic groups or even just I said, EV, right? A lot of you think okay, what's an EV? That's pretty obvious, right? But maybe one group might define electric vehicle differently than another, or they're hey, I want to know a certain kind of model because right now we don't have a national standard for the plugs for those EVs. So maybe that's a question we should answer, and then maybe one data collection did it properly, another one didn't, or even just looking at education or workforce data, how people define certain school districts or certain programs, they're all different. And so that's a nightmare to figure out how you're gonna merge all that. So let alone trying to figure out the privacy, just trying to make sure the quality is good. So I think I've stressed out enough. So now going into the privacy aspect of it, that's where that matrix came from was is it even good to merge it from begin with? And I think that is like the first thing we need to ask ourselves is like, is that potential public good and benefit for society outweigh the like a risk? And if it becomes life-threatening, then that's something that we really need to maybe put the brakes on and really consider not doing that. Because like, although I'm a big advocate for making sure that we can safely expand access to different data sets and kind of think about how we might merge them or integrate them, and people are like, oh, the executive order that came out about no longer siloing our data, there's a reason why some of the data sets have been siloed because of those privacy concerns. And so if we decide to remove the walls, we got to be very careful and thoughtful about how we decide to remove that wall. And again, thinking about what is the actual public good and purpose of making sure those data sets are linked or together. Anyways, I say this, one last plug. So thing is that we are very concerned about government data, and I'm very glad that we are, but I really want people to be very cautious about how they share their phone number. So this is my like PSA to everybody in the audience and listening or wherever. When you give your cell phone number for a rewards program, it is the most identifiable piece of information next to your social security number. That is how companies link your data accurately to other data sets. Did you know there's a platform that companies can opt into it's like a platform where there's a profile of you based on your cell phone number that other companies can opt into to add information they have collected with other companies. So anytime your cell phone has been used at a grocery store, to electronics store, to anything at all, they can all opt in and merge it, and then they have a full profile. So if you're worried about the government, I'd be more worried about these other companies first. Like, I'm that random weirdo who gives out fake numbers or never gives my cell phone number or just pay more money because I don't want to get the rewards program and get into really awkward arguments with the Best Buy guy, because that totally happened, because that guy really wanted me to get into the rewards program, and I said no, and then he thought I was crazy. So, that's the situation, and that's something we have to be concerned about because these companies are already doing that.
So we do need to wrap up. There are a couple of questions I'm pretty sure you want to answer from the online folks, though.
Okay.
And one of them ties into what you were just saying, which, by the way, I mean, my simple solution to that has been to give Jenny's phone number. Now you know. So the question was, and you just gave an example of one, is there anything we can do to regain agency over how our data is collected and used?
Yeah, that definitely the whole being very thoughtful how you share your cell phone and making sure when you click through things, making sure you do not opt in, because there's opt out versus opt in. Some places will automatically opt in for you. I've actually reported a couple places where I know I opted out and they put me in anyway, and so they cannot do that. Anyways, I'm that annoying person, so just FYI. Good. Anyways, so there's those things. It's also if you have children, so I tell this to all my friends who have kids. I know it is really great to have Instagram and having little cameras in your phone. When you take a picture of your child, please cover their face, put it to the side or something until they turn 18. Because do you guys know why there's other reasons why our facial recognition got way better, but what's the best way to make sure that it is somebody over time? All those photos where everybody's like, this is my baby at 1 month, here's my baby at 2 months, right? That was a big trend for a bit. Or here's my happy birthday, blah, blah, you've turned so-and-so years old. You're giving high quality, highly accurate data publicly about your kids who haven't fully consented on whether or not they are participating. So that is something to really think about. There's a lot of concerns about children's privacy laws and protecting their data. So if that's one thing to think about too, it's just being very mindful of what you do share. I have on my Strava account, because I showed you on Strava, you're like, Claire, that shows a lot of information. There was also a report about somebody finding a secret military base and things. You have to request to be a follower of me. I changed the privacy settings. That's something else to think about. I use Venmo, but Venmo's great and secure for the fact of changing or sharing, exchanging money. But I don't like that social aspect of it. It's so weird. I might make all my transactions private. So that's another thing to think about too, is look at all the privacy settings, actually make sure it's turned off. That's why also some of my other social media accounts, they don't give me targeted advertising because I've gone through the settings and tell them to don't record my data in a certain way. It's sometimes hidden and it's sometimes hard, but you should do it. Or I use certain browsers. Like I don't use Chrome. I actually use the private version of Firefox, for instance.
Well, thanks. That's super helpful. And there's one more question on here that I think will be helpful to many people going forward, especially people who have the opportunity to listen to your presentation recorded later on. And that's this. The person wrote, I find when discussing these types of privacy/ethics issues with my students, they get discouraged and overwhelmed. When raising these issues, how do you also teach your students proactive tools and encourage them that they can make a positive difference?
Oh, that's a great question, because like some people are like, well, why are you on Strava, or why are you on social media? And it's like there is a balance, and so like I do think it's great that we're way more connected than ever before. Like I remember being on the computer as a child, like a really old early computer, and trying to instant message my friend, which was super exciting. After yelling at my parents, like, can you turn off, like, can you hang up on the phone? I'm trying to connect. For those who remember those days, anyways, but like being way more connected and having that community and everything. So that's the part I want people to focus on, is that there is a trade-off, and that one of the biggest things I value is the community. So I get criticized from other privacy people in my field, like, why do I have a Strava? It's like, it was one of the weird apps, I say weird apps, one of the apps that a lot of privacy people don't like because it can be very disclosive, but like the trade-off is like, I have a great community of people that I work out with. I say work out, like I'm on a all-women's virtual cycling team. Yes, those exist. We're in the finals. I hope they're doing really well right now because I'm missing the final like race today, but like we are all encouraging, we all like support each other. We're on an email list, we have a Facebook group, like that's that community. I met somebody randomly in Pittsburgh. She was like our running concierge for the SDSS conference back there. I'm still connected with her on Strava, and I still cheer her on when she does races. Like it was just a random fun connection, and I just love that community, and so that's what I focus on, and that's why I try to encourage, right? And that's the part of privacy I sacrifice, is like I love that community, and I want to keep building on that.
That's excellent. Well, we have one more piece of business to transact. And Claire, we want to present this certificate to you, thanking you for being our first public lecturer.
Thank you.
There will be a more tangible benefit coming along soon, something that you can use to buy running shoes or things like that. So that will be coming to you soon. So please join us right out here for a reception afterwards. And again, thank you all very much.
Thank you.